Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to have you with us this afternoon for the third webinar of the Southeast Committee branch for the IIRSM. Today, we're very fortunate to have a colleague of mine, Ian Baker, who's going to talk to us about the effects of indoor air quality and workplace design on people performance. Before I introduce Ian, just one quick parish notice, a reminder to everybody that we have the IIRSM Awards Dinner. That's taking place on the 23rd of May, Thursday the 23rd of May at Church House in London. And Julie will be putting a link to the relevant place in the website, I think, during the course of this webinar, which I've just seen pop up on the screen. Perfect timing. Thank you very much, Julie. On to the subject matter for today. As I said, delighted to welcome Ian on the call. He's going to talk to us through his extensive experience around workplace and indoor air quality. And just a quick introduction, I won't take all of Ian's thunder, but Ian's MCOR UK's head of workplace, and he has over 25 years experience in the built environment and a background in property consulting and project management. And Ian's been leading the workplace solutions function for MCOR UK since 2015. He's got a range of qualifications you'd expect in this area, and he may talk through some of those as we work through the webinar, but a member of the Institute of Workplace Facilities Management and also a chair of the special interest group around the workspace subject. The last thing I'll add before we hand over to Ian is if you have any comments or questions, please put them in the Q&A function. We'll take the questions at the end, we'll field them, share them with Ian, and hopefully be able to give you a credible response. But otherwise, Ian, thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Really excited to be able to do this this webinar for everybody. Yeah, so great. I'm going to talk about the effects of indoor air quality and workplace design on people, performance, and productivity. It's probably the longest title I've actually come up with for a webinar, but bear with me. These are obviously two really enormous topics, so I'm going to cover each one in turn. And we're going to start with, flip through that one. We're going to start with indoor air quality. But just before I get going on that, I just wanted to share a bit about myself. I'm someone who's pretty obsessed with podcasts, and this is a favorite one of mine. It's called Revisionist History. And it's pretty famous. Presenter Malcolm Gladwell examines historical events that have been misunderstood or overlooked. Now, one of these episodes, I think it's episode 2, is called The Burden of Proof. And in this episode, Malcolm asks the question, what level of proof do we need about the harmfulness of something before we act? And that kind of got me thinking about this presentation and the topic of indoor air quality, because in effect, over the last 25 years, there's been thousands of studies reporting on the effects that the internal environment has on us. And here are just a few of them. I've put some on the screen. You can take a photograph if you want, or you'll probably get these slides at some point. But there's been so many that talk about how the internal environment will have an effect on us. And if you think back about 20 odd years, it used to be called the sick building syndrome. Now, each one of these provides evidence. And you'd think really that with well over 25 years worth of evidence, the measuring and the belief of the indoor air and the indoor environments affecting us should be mainstream. And it should be a mainstream of all of our lives already, but it's not. So the thing that we're going to do for this is, looking at what level of proof do we need about the harmfulness of something. So just for fun, because it's a Thursday, we're going to put this question against the burden of proof scale, which if anybody's been on a jury, you might be familiar with this. But so the question we're going to ask today is, does indoor environment quality and workplace design affect performance and productivity? So if we keep that in mind, we'll go through the webinar and we'll come back to that a bit later. So moving on, the study that I'm going to talk about was one that we joined back in 2019, and it was called Whole Life Performance Plus. It was made up of a group of companies backed by nearly £500,000 worth of investment from Innovate UK. And MCOR UK were case study partners, as was King's College London. And the project was led by LCMB and was backed with academics at Oxford Brookes University, who crunched the data and did some peer reviewing of the report. So it was a really comprehensively and academically researched study. The point of the study was to gain an evidence-based understanding on how to optimize working conditions and improve user experience in the real world. And we did that by doing three things. We looked at the internal environment, which covers temperature and humidity and CO2. And we asked people to provide their self-reported productivity so that we could gather a perceived productivity score. And then we measured their productivity by asking them to complete numerical tests and proofreading and Stroop tests. So we did these three things across a period of nearly 2 years. Now, we had two, as I said at the beginning, we had two case study buildings because this was the unique feature of this research project. Many previous research projects happen in labs or in closed groups, universities, etc. But these were two real life examples that had signed up to be part of this study. Now, one of them was King's College London, and they offered up their JCMB building in Waterloo. And we were the other partners, and we offered up one of our clients, which was NATS and their corporate and technical centre in Hampshire. And in each building, the floor area monitored was of a very similar size with a very similar occupancy. But you can see that these are two very, very different buildings. JCMB built in 1938, whereas NATS built in 2004. Similar occupancy. But the ventilation and how the buildings are actually developing their indoor air completely different. The JCMB building ventilation was very mixed. Essentially, it was windows that open, and they had an in-house FM team. And NATS was obviously a very close controlled mechanical air handling unit system managed by world leading FM company, MCOR UK, a bit biased. So in the field, this translated to a period of 7 months baseline monitoring. So for 7 months, we just measured both the buildings without doing anything. During that period of time, we sent those numerical proofreading and Stroop tests to a range of people in those two buildings. We did 3 weeks of surveys and 2 weeks of tasks. And then after we'd gathered all that data over a subsequent 10-month period, we did some more surveys and some more task-orientated questioning, whilst at the same time tweaking the indoor environment. So during that second 10-month period, we would drive the temperature up where we could. We would drive it down. We would play around with the humidity, and we'd be doing the surveys to try to understand how that change in temperature or how that change in humidity and CO2 affected the results of those Stroop tests, numerical tests, and reading tests. So it's very much live guinea pigs, if you will, in locations where we had measured over that long period of time. And that was really important because you need to measure a longer period of time to account for changes in seasonal variations or holidays, and we did that with that increased time, which most other studies don't generally have the affordability to do. So we learned that JCMB essentially experienced a much wider range of indoor temperatures compared to NATS, and you can see this in the graph here. JCMB suffered a scorching 30 degrees in summer and an extremely frigid 16 degrees in winter, whereas the close controlled building at Nats only really had a 4-degree variable, lowest of 22 and highest of 26. So you probably could expect that, given the two methods of dealing with the indoor air quality in those two buildings. And that is where we got to. So let's have a look at humidity. Now, humidity was quite interesting. The guidelines for humidity is somewhere between 40 and 70%, but both buildings had significant periods below 40%. And you can see here that Nats actually had a much longer period of time below the 40% RH. And this was most likely due to the effects of their air conditioning. And then we had CO2. So again, CO2 for the JCMB building, which was actually located on a very busy roundabout in Waterloo. They had highs of up to 2,100 parts per million, whereas the closer controlled Nats building had a high of 1,500 parts per million. And what we learned from this is that, watching all that data, essentially it boils down to this: if you feel uncomfortable, then you believe you're less productive. So if you feel that you're uncomfortable, then you are reporting that you are less productive. Obviously, the solution isn't to provide everybody with a cushion. This is all about your thermal sensation and preferences. Change the slide there. And what that was showing us is that from perceived productivity, the data shows that if you're feeling uncomfortable, you can be up to 16% less productive than if you're feeling comfortable. And this works for both feeling too hot and too cold. So looking at the graph here, feeling comfortable, uncomfortable is 1, comfortable up to 7. The more comfortable you got, the more self-reported productivity you were reporting. But it works with the thermal sensation in terms of hot and cold. So if you are much too cool, then you would be reporting that you are less productive, up to a sweet spot around about 4, 4.5, and then getting too hot, reporting that you're dropping off, productivity starts to dive off a cliff again, as you say that you're less productive again. Now, the interesting thing, if you're looking at these two lines, the green and the blue, is that despite the huge differences, the huge variations of a scorching 30 degrees in the summer and 16 in winter, and the 4 degrees that you noticed that the Nats occupants were fortunate to have, those lines are very close together. So both buildings are following a very similar path in terms of whether you're feeling uncomfortable and whether you're reporting yourself as being productive. And this comes down to this fact, which is I think it's coined by an American, but it's probably one of the most British formulas I've ever seen. It's reality. Your reality minus your expectations equals your happiness. And that's a really interesting point, that the people in the JCMB building, they were fully expecting to be either too hot in the summer or too cold in the winter. And their building gave them that reality. So they weren't massively unhappy about it. They're obviously reporting that they're less productive, but there wasn't a great deal of complaint. Whereas the building where the Nats people were operating in, even half a degree change would instigate calls to the help desk to say, we're too hot or we're too cold. And then they would be reporting the same levels of perceived lack of productivity when they were somewhere, the low 22s and the ups of the 26s. So it's really quite interesting that when you're looking at what your reality versus your expectations is, it can have a huge bearing on whether you feel that you're being productive or not. So again, this should be stressed that it's not a goal or an excuse for providing people with bad environments, and we shouldn't really be using that as an excuse. But as I said, when you're expecting something as bad as that, and the reality is that that's what you're faced with, then you tend not to be that disappointed with it. So this worked as well for indoor temperature at all levels. So if we look at the perceived productivity being linked to feeling comfortable, this is the same for actual performance and actual temperature. So these are the results that we had from the actual task performance scores. And we could see that in reality, as temperature increased, the level of proofreading, the level of numerical tests, and the Stroop tests all started to decline. So although we're saying that the self-perceived productivity was dropping off when people felt that they were uncomfortable, we were then able to prove that as the temperature rose, their actual productivity was reducing at the same time. So in effect, they were feeling that they were being less productive, and they were being less productive. So let's move that along. But the main kind of canary in the coal mine, as it were, is CO2. Now this is the fact because CO2 is actually one of the least measured indoor environment conditions that we have. We have all started talking about it a little bit more since the pandemic, but there are still a huge number of buildings and organizations that simply don't measure CO2. And I was presenting this to a client a year ago, and during my pitch, where I was saying, MCOR, we can come and we can help you measure your indoor environment, and these are the reasons why it's a good thing. And I actually said to them, look, no one measures CO2. And the customer sat back in his chair, and he looked slightly smug, and then pointed to a white box on the wall and said to me, that's a CO2 sensor measuring this meeting room right now. And I thought, well, I shouldn't really say that again. That was a bit of a daft thing to say. But I went over and I looked at this little white box, and I read the number, and I sat back down and said, well, it says it's 560 parts per million. And then there was a pause, and the customer eventually said, is that good? And I probably shouldn't have pointed and laughed at him, but it was interesting that he was measuring something, but he had no idea what the number actually meant. And the fact is that we often mistake a rise in CO2 as suddenly feeling too hot, or feeling that the air has become a bit too stuffy. So when we're in really long meetings and the CO2 is beginning to rise, and you only have to think of the board meetings in your organizations, where you could argue that there's more than the usual amount of hot air bouncing around, but we don't know, our bodies don't know if the CO2 is rising, but our brains do. As it begins to affect us, we may start to feel tired, our concentration starts to wander, we start to wonder what we're going to be having for tea, or if you're like me, what bike I'm going to buy next. And what can we do about that? And when we're faced in this situation, feeling tired and a bit hot and stuffy in a boardroom, the only thing we can do is the thing that most of us do, and that's reach for a cup of coffee. And weirdly, there is no link between coffee and reducing CO2. It would be amazing if Cafe Nero wanted to sponsor that, and I'd be quite up for that because I do like a Cafe Nero, but I can guarantee there is no link between coffee and whether or not you're reducing the CO2 in the meeting room that you're in. But of all the environmental conditions, temperature, humidity, whatever it might be, the that CO2 has by far the biggest effect on our productivity. And we can see this on this graph, that where in our test environments we had a rising CO2, we proved that there was a 12% reduction in productivity because of it. And the interesting factor for this is that the CO2 in the environments that we were testing only ever got generally as high as 1200 parts per million. But we see regularly parts per million readings of 1500 to 2000 in normal meeting rooms. So it's nearly double that. So you can imagine the kind of extrapolating percentage reduction in productivity that working in a higher CO2 environment can actually produce. And you never really know, if you're not measuring it, then you never know whether it's CO2 that is actually undermining your performance and productivity. And it's an interesting question about this productivity piece, whereas the Stroop tests that we did under this study showed there was an actual reduction in productivity. It can also have an effect on your ability to make decent decisions. So usually in boardrooms and meetings, we go through all of the data that we've been given, and then somebody is tasked with making a decision at the end of seeing all that data. And that's the point where the CO2 has reached its highest. The person is probably already quite tired and is feeling the effects of the CO2 without realizing it. And then they're being asked to make a decision on something. So it's an incredibly important thing that we start measuring it. Now, there's a pretty big understatement for a webinar is that breathing is important to us. And I did a bit of research in this. We take roughly 16 breaths a minute, which is 960 breaths an hour and about 23,000 in a day. And the volume of a single breath is about 500 milliliters. So that's a bottle of water. And the picture of the balloon is up here because by mid-December, given that we're in mid-April, by mid-December, each one of us will have breathed out enough hot air to fill a hot air balloon. But I'm sure you can all point to someone that might be able to do that in far less time than that. But it's about 3,000 breaths to fill up a hot air balloon. It's not 23,000, it's more than that. That's in a day. So the interesting thing of those 22,000 breaths is that a vast majority of them are actually taken indoors. Most of us spend well in excess of 80% of our time indoors. So of the 23,000 breaths that you take in a day, about 22,000 of them will be from the indoors. So the quality of these indoor breaths is becoming more and more important to all of us. And I always think about this, that when you walk into a building, whether it's an office, an auditorium, a cinema, whatever it might be, the environment that exists within that building is soon to be inside you as you're breathing that in. And what strikes me about this is that most people responsible for providing those spaces and those people entering those spaces will have absolutely no idea whether the air inside is having a positive, a neutral, or a negative effect on them. And I think that's a fascinating thing that we all need to start getting behind and understanding, so that we can look after our health and well-being in a far better and more insightful way. So let's recap on the findings that we had from the WRP Plus study. Occupant perception is incredibly important when it comes to improving productivity. Task performance is affected by the indoor environmental conditions, such as temperature, humidity, and CO2. And perceived productivity and task performance offer similar results in defining the links between IEQ and productivity. Now, that last one's quite important because obviously not everybody can go off and do Stroop tests, and you wouldn't want to ask all your staff or employees to start doing numerical tests and proofreading and Stroop tests all the time. But you can ask them whether they feel that their workplace permits them to work productively. And they might well start to think that, well, the temperature, I'm not comfortable, I feel less productive, or I might feel that the air is stuffy, therefore I'm going to report that I'm less productive. And we have correlated this against actual task performance. So it's a really good way of correlating those similar results and not actually having to go through this whole rigmarole of developing a study. Some further key findings was that people were 12% increased on proofreading tests when the levels were below 1400 parts per million, and 12% higher in numerical tests when the levels were below 1000 parts per million, and 38% quicker in numerical tests when CO2 was below 1000 parts per million. So not just more accurate, but quicker as well. So what's happening now? Well, at the moment, there's been a report from the University of Surrey that are calling for worldwide indoor air quality standards to be adopted. There's people that actually believe that this isn't even far enough. It doesn't go far enough. It should be much higher than that. But whilst they're working through that, what we can do is start to measure our indoor air quality, because that's extremely important. We need to understand what that measurement actually means, and then we need to act upon it, because once you're measuring something, it's no good unless you're acting upon it, and we need to make improving the IAQ a mainstream activity. So obviously, said about when you go into buildings, you pass on responsibility of the air inside those buildings to the people that manage it, and you don't get buildings without workplace design. So let's look at the other aspect of the workplace, which is how they are actually designed. And I've got an example to talk you through today, which is it's a customer workplace that they came to us a couple of years ago to have a look at. They already knew that they were struggling with productivity. It was a call center, so it wasn't just perceived productivity, it was also actual productivity, because they could monitor the number of calls that people were making. It was really messy, it was outdated, it used furniture that was actually designed for the deeper monitors, so that's why they're on these angles, and it was very awkward circulation, and everybody had reported bad indoor air quality. It looked very much like this. There's a whole other task about culture that contributes to productivity, and the whole floor plate had developed a culture of my desk and my space, and it was much less about team and much less about departments, very siloed. People were eating food at their desks. They were old and the design didn't work. And there was a lot of pedestal usage where it had really encouraged people to take ownership of spaces and not share them with colleagues. So with that in mind, we did a whole project that was not just looking at the space, but we pulled apart all of the mechanical ventilation as well. So we were improving everything that we could put back into that building, making sure that filters were in there, that the air quality was as good as it could be. We focused not just on air quality, which is, and you'll have heard me say the difference between the two, indoor air quality and indoor environmental quality. So air is obviously temperature and CO2, and the environment covers stuff like lighting and noise and acoustics, so all of the factors of being inside. So we looked at everything that we could to improve that building, and we redesigned it to look like this. So proper desks that were used for flat screen monitors, that allowed us to save space, which allowed us to make a better use of circulation. It felt a lot more brighter and airy. There was a whole atrium here that had previously been blocked because it had caused quite a lot of glare that was affecting people, but we made all that work again, and we pulled all that open, and we made sure that we didn't put desks anywhere near the glare of the atrium, and we massively improved the whole building. But again, like the WLP Plus research survey, we didn't just do that and kind of pat ourselves on the back and say, yeah, we've done a good job there. We actually needed to do some measuring pre and post to make sure that what we were doing actually did have that bearing and that improvement. So you can see on the screen here that from a pre-occupancy perspective, lots of things like natural light, noise level, temperature control. So obviously people are struggling with temperature, and air quality. Very important to people, but most of them are feeling very under supported with that activity, with that element. Now, after we completed our project, we could show that all of these things had improved for everybody across the board. That we had improved the control of temperature. Temperature is a funny one. It's really difficult to make everybody happy all of the time, and it's practically impossible. But if you can get somewhere up here, then it's a benefit to everybody. So we were quite happy with how that temperature score ended up working. But we also moved air quality up quite a lot, and although we might not have created a space that has the lowest CO2 or the best temperature, we've moved that needle quite a long way. So you know, we were able to show that that productivity gain has actually been achieved. Similar for other areas in the building, which doesn't necessarily relate to IEQ, but the general decor and the feeling of the space generally improved. The general facilities, so the restaurant, canteen, and the tidiness, so people are actually caring about the building more, that also improved. You can see that there from the next bar chart. In fact, general cleanliness shot up really, and it has maintained that general feeling as well. And then when we're looking at stuff like productivity, this self-reported productivity element, as I said, people were saying that they were fairly low reporting there of 70% kind of productivity agreement, saying that this space actually enables them to be productive. And after our project, then that score went up to 86%. So you know, it's very tangible results that can be shown that result in improving productivity. And it also improved their community aspect as well. So there's another metric that says whether you originally felt part of a team, part of a community, and that was incredibly low in that space. And then once we'd done the project, that had shot up by about another 30%. So we'd created a wonderful community for everybody to work in. Now, the workplace now encourages a culture of our space. There is a reduced element of silos, and there's a team mindset. We put in things like apps where you can order your lunch from an app, because on a call center you have a very limited break. So the ability to order something and then get it delivered to you is incredibly important. And we eventually we removed pedestals and provided lockers, so that that removed the desk ownership queues, because that was obviously causing a problem. So the key results for that whole project, including the improvement in indoor environment, was that we could report 23% improvement on self-reported productivity. We were able to prove that there was a 27% increase in a sense of community, and the satisfaction from the indoor air quality had shot up from 33% to 58%. And then natural lighting from 35 to 88%, just bearing in mind that it was incredibly low at the beginning because they decided to block off that atrium. So having gone through all of that research with WLP Plus and the project that we did that I've just gone through, if we think back to the beginning of the presentation where I talked about this burden of proof and what level of proof do we actually need about the harmfulness of something before we start to act. I'm kind of hoping, I mean, this is obviously a predetermined slide, so it's going to move up anyway, but with all of the data that I've thrown at you this afternoon, if we're going to put the question, does the indoor environment quality and workplace design actually affect performance and productivity, then fingers crossed that we can all now agree that it does, without a shadow of a doubt, have a bearing and an effect on productivity, and that we should all be galvanized now into making this a far more mainstream thing that we're all looking at in terms of our buildings. And I urge everyone to consider measuring their internal environments and to see how they can benefit everybody in their organizations from using that space. So with that, I've come to an end. Very happy to take as many questions as there may be. Also, if you'd like to scan that QR code that I worked out how to do about 5 minutes before the webinar, then you can scan that code and it will take you to my LinkedIn page, where I'd be very happy to connect.
Ian, thank you so much. Really insightful. I'm just seeing if any questions have popped up in the Q&A or indeed the chat. We'll give it a couple of seconds to see if anybody posts anything. I thought quite interesting, a couple of points you picked out there. And I guess one of the questions I had was around the momentum that we may have seen around the exit or during COVID in terms of how much appetite there was for this type of activity, particularly around air quality and novel technologies around UVCs and stuff, and whether you've seen that sort of momentum maintain itself as we've moved away from COVID, or whether you've still seen it being right up there in customers' thinking.
That's a really good question. You're right. It suddenly became really de rigueur to start measuring this stuff in terms of ventilation and cleanliness, and I think that we have seen it start to drop away again. There are some customers where it has remained a really important aspect, and I think that it very much depends on the sector that they're working in, whether or not it has remained a really important thing to them. And I think in some regard to that point, it generally seems to be linked now to the employees that are driving that demand for understanding whether or not they're in spaces that affect them or could potentially negatively affect them. So rather than being a pre-pandemic, it was very much a top-down, the business board wanted to understand what was going on. Now it's very much driven from the bottom, where people are actually demanding that the spaces that they use are safe for them. So yeah, no less important, but I think where it comes from and how it's being driven it has changed since we've come out of the pandemic. I think people are far more aware, quite rightly so, about how the space that they use can affect them.
Yeah, thank you. And I thought it was also quite interesting around the point you made with customers or clients having the ability to measure CO2, for example, but actually not doing a great deal with it. And if you think about the places that we, for example, will go and visit across the UK and sit in meeting rooms of, let's say, 6 people, in rooms which do not measure parts per million CO2, how often it would exceed 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 parts per million, and the true impact that can have on someone's cognitive function. I just don't think we realise the sort of scale of it.
No. I think that there's another report that says that if you're in a space that's about 2,000 parts per million for a period of time, it's the same as having a beer. So you kind of like don't generally, well, not these days anyway. Maybe if you go back 20, 30 years, you probably might have made some big decisions after a beer, but not so much anymore.
Yeah, cheap evening out. Get a bunch of people in the room and have a good conversation. I guess the last thing I thought was quite interesting, and as an observation, was around the improvement in all of those factors that you measured as a result of the workplace reorganisation and a perception of their space. And I think there is something in there, isn't there, around psychological contract that you're getting from that investment in people, the fact that the sheer fact that people are seeing you're paying both time and money into their well-being and productivity, and that in itself has something an impact psychologically as a positive factor, in their outlook on both the organization and therefore probably their productivity.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's I think that's the really interesting point, that correlation between perceived productivity and actual productivity, and you can kind of improve that productivity by, exactly as you're saying, by actually just investing in those people and showing them that you care about them, trying to do something to improve their workplace environment, and that will actually have an impact. It's not simply acceptable just to kind of do that, because I think that, as we said, people are going to start becoming more and more invested in understanding and measuring their own spaces. The thing that I think has probably changed is that a while ago, to measure CO2, you had to have a plug-in sensor, and it would heat up and it would do some stuff inside to measure the CO2, but it needed to be plugged into the mains. And now you can get tiny sensors that can measure very accurately CO2. And obviously that goes back to a central kind of BMS system or a portal. But it won't be long before we have these things in our phones. With the rise of well-being and things being more important to us in post-pandemic, it only takes a phone provider to stick a sensor in a phone, and then we can start measuring, our gyms or our homes or our hotels or wherever we are, and then voting with our feet accordingly if it's just not good enough.
Now there's an idea.
Yeah.
Here we go. Let's patent that. I'm sure it's already being done. So, Ian, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing some of those insights. Really, really great stuff. Thanks to our listeners, our watchers, and I guess we'll aim to share these slides through Julie at the IIRSM, and we'll post the recording on YouTube in due course, and we'll send that out via media comms. Otherwise, thank you to yourself, Ian, again, and thanks for Julie for organising. I'll call it a close there and wish everyone a very good afternoon.
Thank you all. Thanks for having me.